Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the coupon code is HORROR, and it's good for 10% off any order of $10 or more, and it's going to run from October the 12th through November the 11th. That's right, our friends at Noble Knight hooked up a killer code for Halloween, and it's called HORROR. So put that in to get your discount code of 10% off any order of $10 or more, either online or if you're lucky enough to walk through those beautiful doors in person. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, but Hambone, I have so many games on my shelf that I don't know if I have any room for more games. Well, let me tell you something cool about our friends over at Noble Knight Games. They have a killer buy, sell, and trade program going on. And if you want to know more about that, check out nobleknight.com/buy, sell, trade. This is a great way for you to unload some of those games that maybe you don't love as much as you should, but somebody else would love it even more. Or if you've got a collection you're dying to get rid of to make more space, check out nobleknight.com/buy-sell-trade for more information on that. Otherwise, it's time to get a discount, and a killer discount at that. So 10% off any order of $10 or more, running from October the 12th through November the 11th, from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. Happy Halloween from the Vintage RPG Podcast.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and today, Stu and I sit down and have an awesome conversation with Kathryn Hymes, one of the amazing minds behind Thorny Games and Xenolanguage, a game about first contact out on Kickstarter right now. Now, this is one of the coolest concepts I've ever heard for a game, and I am so excited for you, dear listener, to hear more about it. And now, without further ado, we're going to jump right into the conversation with Kathryn Hymes. Hey, Kathryn, how's it going?
Going great. How are you?
Oh, I can't complain. I'm so psyched that you're joining Stu and I on the show tonight to talk about Xenolanguage, a game about first contact.
I am also psyched. I am stoked. Thank you for having me.
It is our genuine pleasure to have you here. So why don't you tell our listeners a little more about Xenolanguage?
Yeah, gladly. So Xenolanguage is a tabletop story game about first contact with alien life, some messy human relationships, and what happens when they all mix together. It kind of takes a nod from, I guess, what we're calling soulful sci-fi media, like the movie Arrival, movie Contact, a short story, Story of Your Life, all of that good stuff. But the game tells its own story. You end up exploring your relationships with other characters on the mission as you uncover meaning in an alien language. Usually a game for 2 to 4 players in 3 to 4 hours. And I have to mention that its core mechanic, to try and do justice to the idea of first contact with alien life, is a modular channeling board of alien symbols. So channeling is a very basic part of the collaborative storytelling in this game.
By channeling, do you mean like a Ouija board?
It is like a Ouija board, yes.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, modular in the sense that it's a custom board. So there are alien symbols that kind of pop in and out of the board so that you can reload it for replayability and to be surprised at different games. But yes, it uses channeling as a core mechanic.
So this is sort of like a difficult question for you to answer on a podcast, it being an audio format. But what do they look like? How do you portray the alien language?
Oh, this is a really good question, and actually was something that took a long time for us to get to because we really wanted to get it right. And like fundamentally, so it's a tabletop game, and there's a board out in front of people that is kind of meant to represent this platform that is the alien platform that you interact with in order to speak to our otherworldly visitors. And depicting aliens, like there's a lot of prior art. And some of it is really inspirational and some of it's really hokey, but like it's a tall order to try and like really use the board as like a moment that can like be an immersive object. And so it's been a journey. That's my long way of saying that. One of the biggest things that we did, so we worked with this artist that took a while for us to find. He calls himself a symbolist artist, which helps, but it was really trying to think about how we can explore the idea of connection, which is really fundamental to the game, but make it seem kind of alien and organic in the same way. So the board is inspired by actually the way that soap bubble networks work together and kind of bubble up, mixed with the way that smoke kind of congeals together, all in kind of this webby connection-based tableau that has almost these symbols that are fruiting out of the board. And so the symbols themselves are like these chits that you can plug in and out of the board and that you discover new meaning under. But it's all within this kind of webby connection, soap bubbly alien backdrop.
This is probably like going really deep in the weeds in like the first 5 minutes of the interview, but do you make fundamental assumptions about how language works? Like, we're humans, so everything that we create is sort of fundamentally human in some way. So how do you convey an alien language that comes from a life experience that's completely foreign to us, yet is also able to be kind of perceived by humans in a gamey kind of way? Does that make sense?
Totally does. The fundamental inspiration for this game, like there was a core idea that we had a long time ago, and we've been chasing that idea for a long time to ultimately make it work. But Ouija is a really good way of simulating first contact. So you asked a question sort of about like the experience of communicating, but also just kind of like the core guts and logic of what you can assume about an alien language. In terms of the experience of communicating, like what Ouija can do is like, one, it's a physicalized touch-based thing. It just has naturally an eerie element to it. And what's amazing about it too is that you're effectively like communicating with your own subconscious. And so you're also communicating with like the collective subconscious of all your fellow players at the table. So Ouija as like a grounding mechanic to be the way that you simulate first contact has the right, I guess, gravitas and oomph and like eeriness that you would imagine experiencing if you're, one of the lucky, people that actually gets to make this kind of contact. And I think that we stumbled upon that idea early. What in terms of language that it's really based on is that the game is not really about putting together grammar or anything like that. That's really not kind of our jam around language and the way that we play with it. It's really around meanings that are important under these symbols. You kind of tinker with semantics. And one of the core things about like this alien language that you discover is that there are, I guess, terms, concepts for things that are important to them that you won't have clean translations for. It's almost like, if you've seen those listicles where, there are these long German words for like, you're walking in the forest and you stumble on an acorn and then you think of your mother or something like that.
Yeah.
When you have a word like that, you grab for it and you see the world a little differently, maybe. It certainly is like something that is easily packaged into a core part of what could be your worldview. And the idea is to kind of unravel what is part of the worldview, like laid out on the table behind these symbols, and then imagining kind of what logic you can possibly put towards the movement of Ouija. So it's really something that like it comes from the subconscious of the players. And it's been amazing to watch so many playtests about people having these very deeply involved emotional conversations with the board and other people, but that really to them feel like that they're communicating with something beyond. And that's what we were hoping to go for. And it's taken a while, but we got there.
It sounds to me like you found a way to help people in turn, and I'm gonna go for the pun here, to make first contact with the parts of themselves that are alien to their own existence.
Yeah, snaps to that.
Thank you very much. I especially find it really interesting in a year like 2020 where throughout the world we're all finding new ways to communicate, because in a lot of ways there is so much loneliness and isolation going on. And so a game like this where you are finding a way to get a deeper connection during a time of great longing and isolation, I think is really impressive. Can you talk to me a little bit about the experience of having people do this from a distance and what that is like?
Yeah, absolutely. This was really a point of just great iteration for us this year. The game is fundamentally about connection, like you said, and really like getting new perspective on relationships that are important to you. Like in the game, there's different ways that you kind of assign meaning to symbols through your understanding of shared memories and flashbacks, but also like you change based on what happens to you as part of first contact. So you make new decisions based on it. So it's both this like give and take of how you evolve, but all of it kind of rooting back into your connections with other people and what that says about you and how you ultimately see the world differently after the experience. And like one of the great parts about playing it in person is just the physical element of Ouija, right? And that you are touching the same planchette altogether. And so it feels like this collective action that you're taking. Then you're discovering more of the board and experiencing first contact again throughout the game session. But obviously, this wasn't going to work for a pandemic world. And in general, we do a lot of play remotely too. So it called upon us to think about how do we make a good, convincing, just persuasive channeling experience remotely? Because if you go out there and look, and maybe this isn't how everyone spends their free time, but we sure did a lot. There actually isn't a lot of really convincing collaborative channeling experiences that you can find online. But thanks to our friend Tabletop Simulator and lots of good coding by my design partner, Hakan, we now have a maybe first of its kind, don't know, like group collaborative channeling that works at a distance remotely. And so now we've actually moved all of our playtesting, iteration, regular actual plays online and have been actually playing a ton more during the pandemic than maybe what we did in the past. So it's been really fruitful. The way that it actually functions within Tabletop Simulator is people will kind of draw this pattern on their mouse pad across the board, but they'll all do it simultaneously. And as that happens, sort of a planchette is kind of taking an average of all of their movements and then ultimately going towards like what is the prevalent combination of them and moving that way. And one of the, important things that does too is just like in Ouija, you can cheat. And that you can favor certain symbols, you can push the planchette one way or another, like you can make active decisions about where it goes, but also knows that it's like collectively averaging the movements of all of the people who are participating. So we found that actually just having what is a more physicalized component that people are interacting with digitally still kind of makes you feel connected in a more physical way, at least than other things that I've seen in this time for play. And so there's the game itself that is about connection and your own evolving view of it, but then just the connection of Ouijaing at a distance. That's really cool.
Truly calling out to the ether and hearing what calls back.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds brilliant.
So, Dialect, the narrative stakes are that the apocalypse is coming and it's going to kill your language. Are there similar sort of endpoint for Xenolanguage?
I think that the stakes are what happens after you've made first contact and that you're meant to be the people that relay the messages. You have a lot of, people listening. And they'll interpret it whatever way they do. This is a more personal story, I would say. It's really through the lens of how it affects the particular people and characters that you're playing as. But it's within the larger context of you have been recruited to a mission and first contact has been made, and you will be interpreting, whether or not these aliens are friends or foes. Are they refugees that are coming here looking to help us? Are they telling us that, we all have a glorious utopian future together if we submit, whatever it may be, right? You are communicating that to sort of the broader world. So those are the stakes of a question.
And all of those things come out emergently through the gameplay, through the collaborative decisions of the players?
Exactly. Yeah. It's not pre-written. Our style of gaming just as a studio, at least so far, has just been what our jam is in gaming and what gives us a lot of energy, which is usually one shots that are GM-less and that are very collaborative in the sense that we want a system to be able to kind of broker different story time among people, but that everyone can collectively kind of be surprised about what happens at the table and that it doesn't take any like narrative prep, say.
I'm glad that you brought up the studio. All of your games, as far as I know, are sort of focused around language. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about why that is and why you settled on that. It's interesting to me that language is something that is like super important. We're using it right now, right? But like at the same time, like it's almost too big to kind of mess with for me, like conceptually, like to make a game out of it like seems impossible, but you've made 3.
Yeah, language has really just been a design muse for a while, and I think will continue to be. There's a lot there. Personally, I lead a double life where I have a background as a computational linguist, and I was trained in that and went to school and did jobs and all of that good stuff. So I just love language, and my design partner is bilingual, bicultural, all of those things. And so it's just sort of a natural worldview that is developed, I think, for both of us. And so when we became game designers and really interested in sort of like how games can be fun and persuasive and immersive and all of that good stuff, like you just kind of, at least like the thing that stuck was just going back to the things that we're particularly passionate about, but that also that like maybe, have really shaped how we see the world in a bigger way. Like we're really interested in the idea of language as a lens on identity and culture. And it's just such a really intimate, cool tool that everyone's really excellent at, that sometimes we talk about in an academic way, but actually affects us in like a really deep emotional way all the time. And there are a lot of stories around language that are either latent or that, we just kind of surf by a lot. So the idea of being able to use a game to kind of look under the hood and like kind of marvel at something together, while at the same time letting it kind of pack its punches that it's really good at doing. Like all of that has been a real inspiration and drive for why we keep on chasing this damn thing. And I think that there'll be more in that way. It turns out like when you have like this broad, powerful tool that is like the most fundamental thing that humans kind of do together, it's just a good thing to play with.
And, sort of uniquely suited to, the story game approach to, role-playing games. Do you have a long history with story games outside of design?
Yeah, I am a longtime game player, and I definitely considered myself a board gamer long before I got deep into story games, though I did sort of like more traditional role-playing games when I was quite a bit younger. But really, there was a chance meeting at Gen Con, I don't know how many years ago now, where I stumbled on Games on Demand. It's just a fantastic group of folks who run it now. Actually, my design partner is one of the people who runs it. But at the time, it was just like you show up, you pick a game without having pre-registered, and then you get a fantastic GM to run you through what a story game is. I know maybe like a lot of people, I had a lot of preconceptions about what role-playing was at that point, or I hadn't really played a role-playing game since like my like Star Wars West End days, and then to see what was on the table was just mind-blowing. So after having an experience like that and then getting deep into being players, like it just kind of naturally tunneled into design.
I have such a block when it comes to story games. They're all so brilliant to me, and they appeal to me on this level of accessibility. You don't need any kit. It's just a bunch of people around a table, using a set of guidelines to tell a story together. And that really appeals to me. But at the same time, like I have such a hard time like shedding all of my, it's not even my preconceived notions. I've read like dozens of them. I understand how they work and they all seem beautiful, but like my D&D brain like just won't let go.
Yeah, I know how that is. It really does feel like you're kind of scratching two different itches, I would say. My last D&D campaign ran for about a year, and maybe was like a year or two ago. And it was after I just inundated myself with story games for a long while. And it was really interesting just to see just how I approached it naturally, having been so baked in story games. And it felt more like a board game to me in some ways. And I think like there's a strategy element to it. Like there's just a lot of other things that you're exploring there. And I loved like with the people at the table that I was with, like we could do a lot of like a role play and immersive stuff that was appealing to us within the system. But it wasn't necessarily, I'd say, the system that was promoting that as like the primary way of playing the game. But I still like had an amazing time, and I love watching actual play of D&D and all this stuff. So it's just like yes and for all of it.
Well, there you go. And it's something that Stu says rather often, which is D&D is the blue jeans of RPGs. They always feel good when you put them on once in a while, and they're always there for you when you need them.
This was my sly way of trying to figure out if you had a D&D background or if you went right to story games, and I'm glad that gambit worked out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure that there probably is a whole generation of folks that are just like all in on story games. The other thing that I do is LARPing, or at least when I could see people. And it's really interesting too to meet a lot of people who like don't do story games or role-playing games or D&D or any of that, but they do a lot of LARP. And it's just like, wow, how did you fall into this world?
I think nowadays more than in the past, there is no actual straight line when it comes to how you get into RPGs and ultimately where you land. Whereas, coming up as kids in the 80s, it was D&D. And yes, Cthulhu and other games existed at the time, but man, like anyone who I know who has an origin story started with that red box. And then they took it from there. And then now maybe they're into story games. Maybe they're strictly board gamers. Maybe they enjoy the cardio aspects of LARP. I don't know. But they always started in D&D. Whereas for like the last 10 years, it's been pretty cool because I'll run into people who have played a lot of other games but never actually played D&D. They always just kind of started, in a lot of ways, in the middle.
Yeah, so true. And now what's so cool to me too is to see people who like, especially in the last couple of years, just with D&D so much in like the forefront, who like I would never have considered them gamers of any kind, but they're so curious about D&D and they desperately want to like get a group together and crack open that story and those modules and all of that and bring it to table. And it's awesome. I'm very curious for both of you. Have you found a story game that has really kind of scratched an itch or been exciting for you coming from more of a vintage RPG background?
Tales from the Loop is the closest to a story game that I think that I've really gotten to the table. And running it, again, it gets back to that D&D thing where I have like D&D brain in terms of how I write my D&D scenarios. And Tales from the Loop requires such like collaborative improvisation. And it was really hard for me. But also we played like 2 or 3 sessions and they were so good. And we got people in our friend group who like come to our board game night or aren't really gamers at the table, and they were totally into it, totally bought into it so wholly and completely that it was really shocking and really affirming. So that's the closest I've come to like playing a story game, and it's kind of weak sauce because it's not really a story game.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm in a similar boat. I was at those Tales from the Loop games, and they were awesome. And it was so wonderful to see people who had never crossed the threshold into D&D. So we'll say that they were the ones that were like starting in the middle and really being a part of something and seeing how like a game like that could work. And that said, like, it is very hard when you are hardwired essentially for Dungeons and Dragons and that style of gameplay to kind of break out of that box that D&D exists in. And yes, there is no real right way to play per se. However, after doing it for years, that repetitive motion of it, it's like being a musician and trying to unlearn an A chord, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, it totally does. Yeah.
So for me, there was the whole thing where Kids on Bikes came around. And I know that's, it does have some dice rolling elements to it, but I really enjoyed the collaborative nature of it. I really enjoyed the story nature of it. I really enjoyed the, hey, think outside the box a little bit here. Like, what would you do? What would you want to do? And then having the things that you do kind of cause a cascading effect that allows the other players to riff off of the things that you're doing. So I think that there are a lot of great games out there like Kids on Bikes and like Tales from the Loop, where you look at D&D as a gateway into other RPGs. These are games I feel like a gateway out of D&D into the world of story games and different kinds of RPGs, if that makes any sense.
Totally. That's a really interesting framing. And it makes me want to go back and look at both of those and think of them as gateway games in that way too. See where they're pointing.
One of my things with story games is that I feel like they're sort of more intimate than my group would. They probably would be fine. Like, I think Hambo would have a good time playing something, but like, it makes me like slightly uncomfortable in the same way that if you told me that I have to get on stage and talk to a bunch of people, like I just get like a little bit of stage fright. I'm not comfortable bringing that kind of stuff to the table, but I was going to try and really rally my group to try Dialect before the pandemic hit. So now we have to wait till a vaccine comes.
Yeah, in our glorious future. Well, actually, one thing that I have found is that, when conventions do happen again, that's been a great way just to explore myself, like playing games with people who are running them or are into them, and then can like help me feel better situated in them too. But yeah, to our glorious future when we can be adventurous with games again.
Be in the same room with people.
Yes.
There is a glorious future where Xenolanguage does come out, and Xenolanguage will be out by the time this episode airs. So, Kathryn, I want you to take a second and tell our listeners about where they can pick up Xenolanguage.
Yes, definitely. So Xenolanguage, you're in the future right now listening to this. Xenolanguage is already out on Kickstarter. The one other thing that I should plug too that will also be true about the future and when Xenolanguage is public is just that we have released as a part of the Xenolanguage Kickstarter a companion book that is an anthology of both short fiction and short games, all original by like an amazing slate of science fiction writers and story game designers who are all tackling their own perspective on First Contact. And so both of those are available to back as part of a collection with Xenolanguage itself. And yeah, I'm really stoked to be able to bring a lot of First Contact play out into the world, which is what you'll be signing up for at that Kickstarter.
Very cool. So, Kathryn, where can people find you online?
Well, they can find Thorny Games and our studio at thornygames.com. And of all of the social places that people gather online, we are most active on Instagram at Thorny Games. So you can definitely find us there. I personally sometimes appear on Twitter as at Chica La Shaw. CHICALACSHAW. Something like that.
Very cool. But guys, go to the website or follow them on Instagram at Thorny Games. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great chatting with you both.
Thanks so much to Kathryn for coming on the show today and talking to us more about Xenolanguage, a game about First Contact. Dear listener, I'm not kidding. This is one you definitely want to check out. So head on over to Kickstarter and see what it's all about. In the meantime, you can also find Kathryn's work over at thornygames.com. Definitely swing on over there as well. And until we meet again, for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.